Okay. Welcome to the third and the final session of India-Afghanistan Security Dialogue, titled Cold War 2.0 and Evolving Global Power Dynamics in the Region. My name is Samiksha Biswa, and I am researcher at Indic Researchers Forum, host of this session. For this session, we are honored to have Ambassador Anil Trigunayat as our session chair. Ambassador is a distinguished former Indian Foreign Service officer who served for over 3 decades, advancing India's diplomatic and economic interests across the globe. He has served as India's ambassador to Jordan, Libya, and Malta, and held senior diplomatic assignments in the United States, Russia, Sweden, and Nigeria. Throughout his career, he played a pivotal role in conflict management, strategic negotiation, and evacuation operations of Indian nationals abroad. A noted expert in economic diplomacy, he is associated with international trade bodies and think tanks, including the Vivekananda International Foundation, and is president of Millennial India International Chamber of Commerce, an Oxford alumni and a TEDx speaker. He remains active in strategic and peace dialogues. To begin our discussion, let me introduce our first distinguished speaker, Dr. Aryan Sharifi. Dr. Sharifi is a lecturer and co-chair of Masters in Public Policy program at Princeton University School of International Affairs. He brings over 15 years of senior level policy and security experience from Afghanistan and international institutions. He previously served in the former Afghanistan government as Director General of National Threats Assessment at the Office of the National Security Council Afghanistan and a senior advisor to the Foreign Minister, contributing to major national and counter-terrorism strategies. Internationally, he has worked with Combating Terrorism Center at West Point and Research Institution in Singapore. His work focus on the security, terrorism, and transnational crimes in Central and South Asia. Building on the strategic perspective, we are pleased to welcome Ambassador Sri Kumar Menon, a former Indian Foreign Service officer who served as Ambassador of India to South Sudan from 2015 to 2018, and Ambassador to Angola from 2018 to 2019. With the concurrent accreditations to Sao Tome and Principe, he had held an assignment at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi and at Indian missions in Oman, Iran, Sweden, Singapore, Poland, and Netherlands, including a special diplomatic assignment in Iraq. He also represented India at the Organizations for the Prohibitions of Chemical Weapons in The Hague. Retired in 2019, he now supports charitable initiatives and work as a senior advisor and consultant. Adding a global strategic lens to the discussion, we are privileged to have Colonel Grant Newsham. Colonel Grant Newsham is a retired U.S. Marine Corps colonel and a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with deep experience in Indo-Pacific security affairs. He served as a reserve head of intelligence for Marine Forces Pacific and was the first U.S. Marine advisor to Japan's Self-Defense Force, where he played a key role in development of Japan's ambiguous force. He has worked extensively on U.S. strategy in the Pacific Island, research in China's military and political welfare, and advice on Taiwan's defense posture. A lawyer by training, he spent over 20 years in Japan as an executive with Morgan Stanley Japan and Motorola Japan, a widely published analytic and speaker. He contributed to the Center of Strategic and Budgetary Assignment report Without Fighting, and is the author to the best-selling book When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Before I hand over the floor to the ambassador, I kindly request all the participants to mute their microphones and to post their questions in the chat box, which shall be taken up during the Q&A session. With that, I request Ambassador to take over the proceeding.
Thank you, Samiksha, and very good evening to all. It is a great pleasure for me to moderate this session with such distinguished panelists organized by the Indian Researchers Forum at, I don't know, an opportune time or not, because the two wars have suddenly erupted. I don't know if you ever thought that when you were discussing, we will be discussing Afghanistan, there'll be again war between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Or this morning it has started between Israel, Iran, and United States, which is spreading very fast. That has again added another complexity to the whole region. And it's really now looks like it's blowing up the whole region. So it's a really a very, very difficult moment for the region. And that means both South Asia and West Asia, as well as for the Central Asia. And we all know that Afghanistan is a very important partner for India, not only because of its strategic location and otherwise, but also because of the popular connect that we have. The kind of, which has been earlier referred to in the very fascinating session, the last one in which I had several friends, and it has been a very important thing. So what we are seeing that Afghanistan's location, strategic location on the strategic crossroads of South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East have always made it into a very strategic place. And therefore, there have been always historically been issues and problems, and the country has been attacked by almost all superpowers of the time. But they have all been defeated in Afghanistan. That is something we need to understand. I remember when Foreign Minister Motaki was here in October last, I think. At that time we met him and he was saying, and he was threatening Pakistan, which had already started the same kind of shenanigans, which they have started this time as well. And he told them that don't forget that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, and we have defeated the British, the Soviets, and the Americans. Now that is something that needs to be kept in mind while we are discussing it, but it does not prevent the problems within the country, whether it is ethnic diversity, which is there, or foreign interventions, or for that matter, the highly volatile and radical Islamic State. But one thing we must distinguish, which the Taliban themselves have said, as far as terrorism is concerned, that they do not wish to export their brand to other countries, especially India, that has been assured. And this has been one of our main concerns. So we are looking at a situation where Afghanistan is unstable, trying to be stable under Taliban. Now, many people always talk about that why Taliban is like this, or women are not being given enough adequate attention, especially by the United States. But we must not forget that the United States, after 20 years of removing Taliban, handed back the power to Taliban. And if you see the Doha Agreement, they very well knew what is Taliban's philosophy is all about. And so thereafter, you expect them and then also sit back on the funds that Taliban, that belongs to Afghanistan or people of Afghanistan. That is something I believe that is very difficult to comprehend, that first you invade a country, then you destabilize it totally, then you want to hand it over to the power from where you took it. You think that they're going to be changing. I mean, those kind of nuances only the United States, and a friend from the US will explain that. Look at the Pakistanis. Now, that's another power which is very much important there. The Pakistanis are very much keen on continuing to hold on to Taliban, or they're rather dismayed now by the Taliban's turnaround with regard to their own deep states motivations that have continued to prevail in Afghanistan. The Rawalpindi gang has tried to control Pakistan. They thought that what they did with Taliban 2.1, or let us say the Mujahideens during the Soviet war and invasion, I mean, the same kind of thing they can continue forever. But Taliban is also not a monolithic organization, and they also have to look at the country. They have to deliver for their people. And I think that that's why they are looking at India today, because India during those 20 years, and has been brought out by Ambassador Sinha and others, is the only country which has helped in the nation building of Afghanistan during that. So I think that that is something that is a very important thing that the Taliban himself, I mean, they all of them understand that India is the only country which is there. When there were evacuations taking place and the Taliban was getting into Afghanistan, they approached our embassy and they told her, "Why are you leaving? You should not leave. We'll protect you." So there is something that we have to differentiate between the Taliban, its religious ideology and the philosophy, and the Afghan as the people and their affection for India. I mean, that's what has come to play around today, as we see here. Now, Pakistan, Iran, China, and the Central Asian countries of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan have the borders with them. So Iran today now again is embroiled in this war, and they have been also saying that we would like to recognize the regime in Taliban regime. Russia has already done that. And Russians are the ones who remain invested in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is a very major concern. Apart from the other geopolitical issues that they have, one of the key issues that while I was in Russia, I came to know about is they said 25% of the Russian population was basically, supported by the drugs that were coming on that Mr. Sindhu spoke about from Afghanistan. And that was a very major problem for the Russians and Russian youth, which was getting addicted to it. So that remains, apart from the fact that we cannot forget that the Soviets or the Russian now would be nursing of their wounds they cannot forget their defeat also at the same time. Americans, for some reason, seems to have given up on Afghanistan at the moment. They were interested in some taking back the ports. But in that connect, now they have started backing once again their old horse, that is Pakistan. And today's President Trump's statement, if you hear, it very clearly says that Pakistanis are doing rather well against Afghanistan today. So they would prefer somehow that whatever they could not achieve, maybe Pakistan would do, but that would not happen, as we have already heard from other. The great game will continue to play in the region. We will continue to have China being very much interested because of its BRI, because of its CEPA, because of its connectivity, and of course terrorism and Uyghurs and others. That is also very much part of it, which we are going to listen from our esteemed panelists. Internally, Taliban, of course, faces many issues. Apart from within its organizational thing, it also has a weak economy, which it has to deal with. It has ethnic diversity, whether it is Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbeks, and all. So they need to be all taken along. Then the biggest problem that they face today also is, apart from Pakistan, is also the ISIS-K, the Khorasan. I mean, that is something that they have to, because until and unless they are able to control them, or the Al-Qaeda, it will be very difficult for them to continue to project that they have changed. Of course, domestically, they have to provide their own people the equal rights. The women must get the possibility, and what we have heard from their ministers here who came to India, I mean, in our discussions, that they are thinking of, they are not averse to the idea of their education, but the proof of pudding lies basically in eating. So we'll have to see going forward on that. On that note, I'll not go forward, but I'll request Dr. Aryan Sharifi to share his thoughts about how he sees the Trump 2.0 and how is the United States foreign policy towards the FPAC region is doing going forward. With President Trump, it's very difficult to say anything, but we will still hope to be educated by you, Dr. Sharifi, for about 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I am indeed grateful for the opportunity to be here a few minutes today and share some thoughts. Please allow me to make a very quick correction to the title. In my introduction, I am actually no longer with Princeton. I was there for a few years, and I've recently left Princeton. So I'm currently doing other stuff. But here I am only in my personal capacity. So that correction I just wanted to know. Now, when it comes to this issue of Trump 2.0 and the US strategy towards the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, I thought it would be helpful if I made very quick remarks about the general security paradigm that is perceived here in Washington. And then in light of that, would then touch base on what that actually means for Afghanistan and for Pakistan, in fact, for our region in general. Now, indeed, it is very difficult, as Ambassador noted, with President Trump, it's very difficult to really say anything because things keep changing constantly. And as such, the security paradigm that this current U.S. administration has been pursuing is really difficult to put it into any of the contexts of the paradigms, the known paradigms that we know in security studies. It's really difficult to corner it, but nevertheless, I'll attempt at that. I mean, in my view, the best way we could conceive of the current U.S. National security paradigm, as really exemplified in the last national security strategy that was published just a few months ago. I would call this a sovereignty-centric, interest maximizing, and economic securitized transactional system. I know it's a very long title, but really that is something that we could see. It is somewhat vague. I would at least highlight 5 factors that collectively I would say can make sense of this current security paradigm that the United States is pursuing. Well, number one, of course, obviously, is that it is a clear departure from the liberal internationalist paradigm that we've had in the world since the end of World War II, really. I mean, even though various US administrations during the Cold War and even post-Cold War had slightly different approaches to national security and foreign policy, but nevertheless, the overall approach and the overall paradigm was that of liberal internationalists. Now is the first time after over 70 years that there's an absolute clear departure from that security paradigm. Number two, this paradigm is realist. It is realist, but it's not classical realism. It is again a clear also departure from the centerpiece of classical realist theory, which was balance of power. And through the balance of power, the maintenance of world order, through the balance of power and building durable alliances, that was classical realism. But this current strategy is not that. You know, they see alliances as transactional, they see alliances as interest-based, they see alliances as temporary and not permanent. In fact, permanent alliances, if deemed asymmetrical, are seen more of as a burden as opposed to an asset in the current US worldview. Number three, great power competition is completely stripped of its moral code and its moral wording. No longer power competition, and great power competition really is deemed between democracy and authoritarianism. Rather, it is seen between advantage and disadvantage. Where there is advantage, there's competition. Whereas there's disadvantage, that competition goes away. So that moral wording that has always been really the centerpiece of US foreign policy and United States national security paradigm does not exist there anymore. For economics is seen also as security. I mean, economics is so heavily and aggressively securitized. And we have seen how President Trump and his team has utilized economic tools very aggressively in pursuit of national security, so that the classical realist view of high politics being security and low politics being economics doesn't exist anymore, and that line is blurred. So economics is brought directly into the definition of national security, and economic tools are aggressively in pursuit in the interests of national security. And then finally, engagement has been selective. So global engagement, which was, again, for the past 75 or so years, 80 years, really, the centerpiece of United States foreign policy, has really been shifted into selective engagement. Now, the United States is no longer viewed as the guarantor of order everywhere in the world. Rather, engagements are both regionally and strategically selective, and those are also very transactional and temporary, strictly based on how the US administration defines national security and national interests for the United States. Now, if you put all of this together, it kind of gives us a sense of what the United States is really pursuing in terms of a very broad paradigm through which they see national security and global order. Now, what does that mean for our region? What does that really mean for Afghanistan, for Pakistan, for India, and collectively in that, if you will, AFPAC region, although I don't like that term? Um, well, on Afghanistan specifically, what I hear from friends here in Washington, or I've been hearing from friends in Washington for the past many months, is that almost after President Trump took power, he commissioned a team to do a review of the United States engagement in Afghanistan, not retrospectively, but in the future, what should the United States do? So he commissioned a fundamental review, and that review took over a year to complete. A few months ago, in fact, about 4 months ago, I hear that review has been completed, and based on that review, now the United States is sketching a new policy towards Afghanistan. What I am hearing in that policy are basically three main elements. Number one, counterterrorism. Priority number one in counterterrorism, and counterterrorism is also very selective here. Not counterterrorism in the broad sense that existed before. It's counterterrorism specifically with regard to the globally oriented terrorist groups. Now, we've always talked about these four categories of terrorist groups operating in that region, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and more so today actually in Pakistan rather than Afghanistan. We had the Pakistani groups, and we had the regional group, we had the Afghan group, and then we had the globally oriented group. Now the United States is only concerned about the globally oriented terrorist group, which in that region really comes down to two groups. You have ISIS Khorasan province, ISIL-K, as we talk about. And then we have the remnants of what is really remaining of Al-Qaeda, although Al-Qaeda has been deemed very, very weak and not in any capacity to conduct any operations anytime in the future. So really it comes down to ISIL-K. And from what I'm hearing, the current US administration is somewhat happy with how the Taliban government in Afghanistan has been handling ISIL-K. I mean, the Taliban have substantially weakened ISIL-K. As a former Afghan government official, I have to admit that they have done, a good job with regard to weakening ISIL-K. Now, priority number two in the current or emerging US policy towards Afghanistan is counter-narcotics, to which also it seems the US it's contained. The Taliban have been able to reduce at least poppy cultivation for over 90%. Now, we have other synthetic drugs, amphetamine and methamphetamine, that is still being produced in Afghanistan and exported abroad. But if you compare overall trajectories of narcotics now and before, now that threat is a lot lower. So the US is also somewhat contained with regard to that. Seems nevertheless that remains a priority. And then the third one, which is a very important thing, especially for the Trump administration, is what they call an end to this hostage diplomacy that the Taliban have been pursuing. And this is a very important thing for the United States because consistently and systematically, the Taliban government have been using hostage diplomacy against the United States and other countries for that matter as well, taking hostage American citizens and then using them as tools to negotiate for gains. And the United States, the current Trump administration, want a strict end to that. And from what I'm hearing, they have very clearly communicated that to the Taliban government. So with regard to Afghanistan, the US policy really comes down to these three very minor, really, elements. They don't really care about human rights or women's rights or state building or so on. Humanitarian concerns, of course, are there, and that's not only for the United States but for the entire international community. Issues of internal political dynamics, they don't care. And I'm very specifically, strictly talking in terms of the technicalities of issues, not politically. What does this U.S. administration policy means for Pakistan? Now, in my view, the U.S.-Pakistani relations going even back to 1947 has never been strategic. It's always been transactional. I mean, Pakistan has never been a reliable partner for the United States ever. I don't think any US administration ever has looked upon Pakistan as a strategic, durable, long-term partner. No, it's never been like that. It's always been short-term, transactional, what Pakistan can do for the United States and what the United States can give Pakistan. I mean, I'm not saying this. I mean, in the words of the current Pakistani defense minister, Khaja Asif, he himself said that. He said clearly over and over again that Pakistan has been doing, in his word, and it's not mine, doing the dirty work for America and the West for over 30 years. And so that relationship has always been transactional. Give Pakistan some money, give them some weapon, whatever they need, and then have them do some of the stuff that the United States wants done in that region. And so that is still the same thing. I don't think, some people think that, looking into all these successive trips of Asif Munir to Washington and Shahbaz Sharif to Washington, that a new strategic outlook is being built between Islamabad and Washington. I don't see that happening. I do not see that the United States really looks and even trusts Pakistan as a strategic partner. Again, it's very transactional, it's very short term. What I hear that the Pakistanis are selling here in the United States, and again, it's based on what the US wants in Afghanistan, but specifically with regard to Afghanistan, is that that Pakistan is telling Washington that, okay, well, you want counterterrorism in Afghanistan, you want counter narcotics, let us handle that to the extent we can for you, so that you don't need to, again, get dragged into Afghan affairs while you're involved everywhere in the world. And this is especially resonant with the Trump administration, given the overall security paradigm that I outlined in the beginning. So the Pakistanis are very smart. They're selling exactly what the US administration can buy, and the US is buying. Nevertheless, let's not forget, and I am repeating myself here, that anything between Islamabad and Washington is strictly transactional, it's short term, it is not strategic. Now, to conclude, what does all of this mean for India-Afghanistan security dialogue? Now, I think, again, I don't want to repeat that, the long-term historical relation between Afghanistan and India, that's all been done. What I think would be to the mutual benefit of India and Afghanistan are a few things, three things at least, three recommendations, if I may field. Number one is for India, at least, to try and move away from this short-term tactical advantage seeking when it comes to Afghanistan. Utilizing this and utilizing that and antagonizing Pakistan and, pumping up the Taliban to say something against Pakistan. Yeah, maybe India would get some tactical short-term advantage out of this, but India is not a tactical country. It's a strategic country. It's a big power. So in the long scheme of the big scheme of things, it would be both mutually beneficial for India and Afghanistan, in fact, for the region, to move away from this short-termism into that long-term strategic look. What does that mean? And that comes to number two. Number two is that translates into trying to dissuade the resumption of another internal war in Afghanistan. Of course, the Taliban government has a lot of problems. We as Afghans have a lot of problems with the Taliban government. We have a lot of problems with the way, with their worldview, with their outlook, with the way they run the country, with the way they treat women, with the very exclusionary politics they've pursued. All of those are very much problematic, and they have to be resolved. But what I am saying is that we no longer have to resort to force and start another chapter of war in Afghanistan to get to that. That war making has really not gotten us anywhere. 5 decades of constant conflict has really not produced any tangible positive results for the country. And so what I would ask India is to utilize its power, utilize its influences, utilize its regional clout to dissuade the formation of another military resistance against the Taliban government. the Taliban government will have to change. The Taliban government, things will have to improve, but not through war, but through peace. And then the third, and this is also related to that, help that political transaction, help that peaceful transaction from the current state of Afghanistan into something that would be more durable, something that would be more acceptable to Afghanistan, to Afghans, and also to the region. And what that would mean at least three main reform pieces in Afghanistan that is needed to actually transition it from what it is right now to something that would be durable. And I'm not suggesting Afghanistan could suddenly become Singapore, but what I am saying is that we can get to a point where things could actually move on. Number one, there has to be a constitutional-based government in Afghanistan. Now, we cannot solely and for permanently rely on directives from Kandahar to run the country. This is not how one can run the country. There has to be a constitution. It can be an Islamic constitution. It can be an Afghan constitution. I'm not
One more
saying
minute,
that we need to
please.
go back.
May I request you for 1 more minute? Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm almost done. So a constitution-based government, one. Number two, in that constitutional government, there has to be respect and guarantee for the basic rights of all Afghans, men, women, all ethnicities. And number three, there has to be meaningful political participation and inclusion. And again, I'm not saying the way we did that under the Republic, which had turned it into a kleptocracy, unfortunately, but some level of meaningful participation so that the majority of the Afghan people would see actually themselves in that government. Now, if we can achieve that, I think the government in Afghanistan will become durable, and that durability would serve both medium and long-term interests between Afghanistan and India. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sharifi, for the brilliant expose that you have given about with your 5 factors and what you come out of the three basically ideas from the study that has been conducted. I'm glad that it has been done. And now you have also broken down that to the counterterrorism, narcotics, and to end of the hostage diplomacy. Of course, whether they will achieve that or not is very difficult to say, because the tools that they deploy for achieving that also will have their own impact going forward. And that's what we are seeing with almost, good thing with our President Trump is that he is transactional or indulges in crass transactionalism. So for him, I mean, in Indian context, we call him Samdarshi, means he looks at his friends, enemies, and frenemies alike and treats them alike. In fact, he's a bit harsh on his friends, and India has been one of their friends and has been subjected to that. We have seen it. But the other suggestions about India that you have given are excellent. And I think that, but one thing you must understand is this: India is not trying to extract these short-term tactical advantages. There has been a very calibrated engagement with Taliban, because as you also mentioned, the Taliban is continuing to gain quite a good foothold in this. It has good intent. Its tools at the moment may not be, as you mentioned, that what they have to do, the 3 things that you mentioned. It has to be constitution, it has to be, everybody should have a right, and there should be inclusiveness. Those are very, very important things. Without that, a long-term continuation may not be possible for them. But they also have problems from their other neighbors. And that is something that is going to be deciding on the way they are going to go. India is going to stand for Afghan people. I mean, we don't treat Taliban, in my view, as something different than the Afghan. They're Afghan first. And so I think that will continue. Thank you very much. It was really amazing and very, very clear for us to understand. Now I'll request Ambassador Sirpa Menon to kindly talk about something that has become very, very topical today. In fact, this about what is happening in Iran and how do you see it going forward. And Iran recently said that they are even considering recognizing the Taliban regime. And how do you see? And also during Prime Minister Modi's visit, we saw Israel said that Afghanistan is also a friend. So how are those going to play out?
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Trigunayat. A very good evening to all of you. Excellencies, distinguished speakers, colleagues and friends. My gratitude to Indic Researchers Forum, Professor Balakrishnan specifically, Samiksha, Yashas and team for inviting me to share my thoughts in this session. As you said, right through this afternoon, we have spent some quality time listening to and absorbing some very, very deep, informative, insightful and thought-provoking sessions, discussions on the various threads that comprise the India-Afghanistan security dialogue. And well, for the topic for me this evening is the crisis in Iran and its impact on Afghanistan. And we find ourselves today in a moment of profound, if I may say, regional turbulence in the Persian Gulf, the Middle East, and our neighborhood itself. And as we speak, and as we just mentioned earlier, tensions have, of course, soared between Israel and Iran, with reports in the past few hours of Israel having launched a preemptive strike against Iran and explosions ringing out in the capital, Tehran itself. It appears that major combat operations are now underway, with the US also joining in and basically specifically seeking regime change in Iran. So unfortunately, things appear to be spiraling out of control, with Iran responding with retaliatory strikes on Israel, and with reports also of explosions in the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi. So this attack initiated by Israel actually seems to be coming back on already rising tensions between Iran and the US over Tehran's nuclear and missile programs, which has been building up for quite some time for the last few weeks. And the past 2 days have also seen a dangerous and intense renewed clashes along the shared border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I will not dwell on it, as this was covered in detail in the previous session by Speaker Mr. Sangar Paikar. The unfolding security crisis in Iran is not just an isolated internal or national disturbance. It is, in fact, a global shockwave, I would say, reverberating across borders, most acutely into Afghanistan. That's the most important part of my talk today. Afghanistan, which is a nation already faced with a worsening humanitarian crisis. And Iran's regime, of course, faces deep internal crisis, economic collapse, mass protests, which in turn have resulted in harsh repressive measures, causing thousands of deaths of civilians and over 53,000 arrests, and it's still counting. So notwithstanding the Israeli and the US action of today, any preemptive strike by the US could seriously weaken Tehran's strategic assets, but could also trigger missile or proxy retaliation and escalate regional tensions. And as things stand, it is right now, it is a high-stakes confrontation, a very subtle balance of military deterrence and diplomacy being played out. Hopefully, there is still room for diplomacy to find ways to prevent a wider conflict. But returning to the topic on hand, looking through the lens, there's a specific lens that focused exclusively on Iran and Afghanistan. I'll try to address three very interconnected dimensions of the ongoing crisis in Iran. First, of course, the genesis and the trajectory of Iran's internal crisis and instability. Second, the direct and indirect consequences of the Iran crisis for Afghanistan's human rights scene, particularly women's rights. And the third, of course, the complex implications for Pashtun identity and regional ethnic stability. Part of it was covered in the previous sessions, but I would like also to have a few words on that as well. So let us first dwell briefly on the genesis itself. The current crisis in Iran actually, as you all know, emerged in late 2025, a consequence of several factors: military, economic, and political shocks. And of course, the 12-day war of June 2025, with Israel and the United States severely having damaged Iran's nuclear infrastructure, missile facilities, and air defenses. So this conflict actually exposed severe vulnerabilities in the Iranian regime's security architecture. And what followed was not merely military recovery, but an unraveling of the Iranian internal security apparatus, and the political economic stability also was shown up. Iran's economy already fragile under sanctions, in fact, spiraled towards near collapse, and the devaluation of the Iranian rial accelerated, inflation surged, and public confidence appeared to have nosedived, eroded substantially. And of course, this was followed by dissenting protests, which were initially fed by the bazaar merchants and the shopkeepers in Tehran. By December of 2025, around Christmas time, mass protests had erupted nationwide. The demonstrations quickly spread to universities and major cities such as Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad, eventually becoming the largest unrest in the past 4 years. And never had we witnessed this sort of a response to the Iranian regime. And these were not limited, isolated demonstrations. They were systemic challenges, questioning the very legitimacy of the regime, and the regime was under severe pressure. And the state, of course, responded with severe repression. Thousands were reported killed in early January this year during a 2-day crackdown. And this was followed by arbitrary detentions, forced disappearances, and accusations of crimes against humanity, the usual playbook which has been used by the Iranian regime to contain dissent. Of course, a short lull followed, but the protests reignited during the 40-day mourning period, where many of the Iranian people were mourning their dead in early February. Simultaneously, US-Iran tensions also escalated. In fact, the relations nosedived substantially. Military buildup signaled the possibility of targeted strikes in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Amid of course, the domestic turmoil, Iran accelerated its own nuclear enrichment program. Unabated, kept on saying, and the brinkmanship, in fact, reached a crescendo in the last few days when the diplomatic ante was also raised in the talks being held with the mediation of Oman. The regime now, of course, faces a difficult situation in terms of strategizing its response, where it could well find itself miscalculating under pressure. So that's the danger. While the Iranian situation is extremely dynamic, nebulous to say the least, and unstable, there are some very, very stark possible scenarios that one can assume in the coming days. It's still, as I said earlier, difficult to predict, but one scenario is, of course, that there is still a probability of a peaceful resolution, but that probability remains very, very low as today's events show. Another possible scenario is that the embattled Iranian regime could very well survive this very, very difficult phase, but that could make it more defiant, could make it more combative and repressive. So the people of the ordinary people of Iran will be at the receiving end of the regime in that sort of a scenario. And there are also chances that a stalemate situation could lead to fragmentation, further fragmentation. A power vacuum could arise, and the country could descend into further chaos and civil conflict. And finally, there is the strong likelihood that any exposure to possible external strikes, which could also trigger a dangerous escalation in the regional security situation in the region itself. And while global attention focuses on Tehran, the human consequences are being exported, particularly for Afghanistan, and have been being exported into Afghanistan, I should say. And this is where we look into the immediate spillover of the crisis into Afghanistan. And for that, it is very, very important to understand the geographical and historical context. Many of them have referred to it in the earlier sessions, but I think it's important that we mention it again, just for context sake. Iran and Afghanistan share a 900-kilometer porous border. Their histories are intertwined by migration, trade, water disputes, narcotics flows, and ethnic communities. The relations between Taliban-led Afghanistan and Iran are quite pragmatic, but at the same time, quite uneasy, I would say. They cooperate on trade, border security, and water disputes, but at the same time, mistrust persists over each other on issues like sectarian disputes, military activity, etc. And the Iranian regime have very deep-rooted fears over Sunni extremism and refugee flows. So for decades, Iran has hosted millions of Afghan refugees in their land. in their territory. And at times, the numbers have exceeded even 5 million. So that's a substantial number. Within Iran, of course, Pashtun communities, mainly migrants and cross-border populations, face tight security monitoring in border provinces, limited political visibility, and economic marginalization, though they are not targeted as systematically as the Baluch groups. But as Iran's economy deteriorated and unrest intensified, Afghan militants migrants, I would say, have become more convenient scapegoats, often framed as security risks. The Afghan migrants have been subjected to intensified deportation campaigns by the Iranian side. In 2025 alone, approximately 1 million Afghans were deported from Iran. And by early 2026, the total returns from Iran and Pakistan have reached 2.6 million. So some estimates even suggest over 4 million returnees during the past year alone. So that's a substantial number and a cause for concern. Afghanistan cannot absorb such numbers for obvious reasons, given the fact that even that over 22 million people already face food security there and in very and dire straits. Of course, there are reports that the Afghan food program is currently forced to turn away 3 out of 4 children due to funding cuts. Shelter, unemployment, healthcare, and education systems are severely strained, overwhelmed, and almost near collapse. So, all said and done, it is clear that Iran's internal crisis and the continuing repression is actually compounding Afghanistan's humanitarian emergency. That's a very sad situation indeed. Now, to take a deeper look at the human rights impact in Afghanistan, I would say that the deportations from Iran do raise very serious human rights concerns for the international community. The first casualty or violation is the principle of non-refoulement, which actually is the practice of not forcing refugees or asylum seekers to return to a country in which they are liable to be subjected to persecution. This is the scenario that returning Afghanistanis face. So that's again an area of concern. Many returnees face arbitrary detention, torture, and in some documented cases, killings have also happened upon their arrival. So the Taliban-led Afghan governance system has often been accused of systematically suppressing dissent with individuals who adopt opposing political postures. They even face heightened risk to their lives. Furthermore, of course, Iran's own use of Afghan militias, including fighters recruited from vulnerable migrant communities, entangles the Afghan identities in Iran's internal repression, potentially exposing them to retaliation and even stigma upon their return to Afghanistan. So if Iran's crisis escalates into civil war or external conflict, the refugee flows may intensify further. Afghanistan, of course, could shift from being primarily a source country to both a recipient and transit zone in a destabilized region. I now, of course, I hope I have the time, but I will come to the fourth thread, which is the impact on women's rights in Afghanistan.
Yeah, 2-3 minutes, please.
Okay, all right. I think I'll be able to make it. This is the women's rights, of course, in Afghanistan. This is another looming crisis triggered by the internal crisis across the border. And many Afghan women had in the first place itself sought refuge in Iran in 2021, precisely because of the restrictions imposed by the Taliban after their return to power 5 years ago. The unfortunate and harsh reality in Afghanistan today is that girls are barred from secondary and higher education facilities. Women are excluded from most of the employment, and the movement is restricted without male guardians. And the new penal framework institutionalizes gender apartheid. So on the other hand, Iran, despite its existing systemic discrimination, have provided Afghan women access to education, employment, and public space to a much greater extent than under the Taliban rule. So Women and children, that's a given. I think women and children constitute approximately 70% of the refugees, which is again an area of concern. And their forced return to Afghanistan strips away these very, very limited but vital freedoms. And of course, they face malnutrition, gender-based violence, forced marriages, loss of educational continuity, and psychological trauma. This destabilized Iran also reduces options and scope for sending remittances that sustain families inside Afghanistan. Moreover, if the Iranian regime collapses violently or faces military strikes, regional instability may embolden hardline elements within Afghanistan who interpret unrest as justification for further internal repression. So in a sense, women's rights in Afghanistan are doubly imperiled by domestic authoritarianism and by the spillover from the external crisis in Iran. So, of course, there are other border issues also, but I will skip that. And a hardened border, of course, may reduce smuggling, but also deeply affects and fractures cross-border communities, including communities like Pashtun and the Baluch populations, who have long-standing cultural ties. Well, the Baluch community number around 1 million, which is roughly 1 to 2% of the country's population. Pashtuns constitute roughly 42% of Afghanistan's population, and they form the core of the Taliban leadership. Let me take a brief view of the spillover effects from the crisis in Iran, which on one hand, there is large-scale returns from across the Iranian border, but this may strengthen the Taliban's demographic base in Pashtun majority regions. If Iran collapses into deep unrest, extremist groups may exploit porous areas to expand further their own operations and further destabilizing Pashtun regions already vulnerable to insurgent recruitment. So the crisis that risks both entrenching Pashtun-dominated governance and destabilizing Pashtun social cohesion is the danger. My thinking is that Afghanistan's economic future is actually tethered in part to Iran's future trajectory. So it's closely linked to each other. And talking about the prospects of peace, the probability of a peaceful resolution in Iran, frankly, remains very, very low. And the regime shows very little inclination towards reform. External actors like the US and the Israeli regime, of course, appear more inclined towards caution than compromise. But domestic protests do persist despite the repression. So that is where Afghanistan's need or look, our view for stabilization would largely depend on halting these mass deportations from Iran and protecting their rights. But without these measures, of course, in place, Afghanistan may slip further into one of the world's gravest humanitarian crises in 2026. So to conclude, just let me sum up the evolving scenario, and let us be clear that the crisis in Iran is not confined to Tehran streets or Iranian nuclear facilities. It is actually reshaping the human geography of an entire region. And for Afghanistan, the consequences are immediate, very severe, and these are like collapsing humanitarian systems, escalating human rights violations, and intensified repression of women, not to mention the ethnic tensions affecting Pashtun identity and national cohesion. The fates of the two nations, Iran and Afghanistan, as I mentioned earlier, directly intertwined by history, geography, and human movement. And if the crisis and repression in Iran continues unchecked, and if the deportations persist without safeguards, Afghanistan's fragile stability will erode further. So we cannot ignore that fact, and the stakes are not abstract, but very, very real. And they are measured in the form of displaced families, silenced women, fractured identities, and lost childhoods and bleak futures. And behind every statistic lies a human story, and which we cannot afford to ignore. And what begins as neglect in one corner of the world can end as a catastrophic incident for all of us. And if we fail to act now, today's silence will become tomorrow's crisis. And therefore, stability is not just a regional necessity, but it's a global responsibility for the international community. So the question, therefore, before us is whether the international community has the resolve to respond with a sense of principled engagement, humanitarian commitment, and diplomatic urgency, or will it stand aside and allow instability to compound into another episode of a generation tragedy? So that's what I wanted to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent analysis that you have made, and you very rightly mentioned about that the destiny of both Afghanistan and Iran is really intertwined, not only by history, by the current things that are happening. One of the interesting things that I quite liked is that the people who have gone to Iran, essentially, and Afghanistan, Taliban also has to see that in Iran, at least, women are very highly educated. And they have a great voice in the country as such. On the other hand, the Saudis, which has been one of the most conservative country, has also started opening up for its women. And so Taliban, with this kind of an archaic philosophy, will find it very difficult to hold on to it for too long. But that remains to be seen how it happens. In the meantime, as you said, the stakes are very high, and the humanitarian crisis is very, very real. And if Iran really, the internal crisis through external intervention blows out of proportion, then we are in for really very major trouble within these two, not only these countries, but between West Asia and South Asia as well. Thank you so much for your very, very considered comments, and that shows your deep knowledge of the region. And now we are back to the United States, I guess. Do we have Colonel Nusham with us? Yes. Well, good evening, Colonel. And you know that you have a very big topic to talk about, but try to focus a little bit, as we have not done, about China so far. So how do you see the Chinese game in Afghanistan, and how is it balancing between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which are today going along? And now Iran is also China's very close strategic partner. And so in view of the US and Israeli attacks today, how do you see things evolving? For about 15 minutes, if it's okay.
Sure, I'll try to run through it quickly.
Thank you.
Sure, but I'm going to start from just very quickly sort of an American take, American view of things based on the national defense strategy, the national security strategy that you saw. And these sorts of papers, they make some people happy, they make some people unhappy. It sort of depends on how one is inclined. The wording is such that you can interpret them many different ways. But throughout the whole thing, maybe the key adversary is China. You see it mentioned directly, indirectly, but so much of what is written is based on a necessary response to the China threat. And just the documents that they're pretty basic, actually, when you break them down. And the first big change is in priority is it calls for hemispheric defense, defending the homeland. And when we say defend it, well, against what? Well, if you scratch the surface a little bit, it's really against China. And it calls for getting our borders under control. And as part of the reason for that is that fentanyl, the drug that has come from China since 2013, has killed well over 800,000 Americans. 800,000. And that's just the dead. The wounded is 10 times as many, these zombies who can't function in American society. China could turn it off in an afternoon. So when the administration talks about homeland defense and getting the borders under control, that is a big, big part of it. And also going after Venezuela, going after Cuba, paying more attention to Latin America. These are things that get specific mention. Well, it's China that is the concern. Chinese influence in Venezuela, using Venezuela and Cuba as platforms for surveillance, intelligence gathering, regional subversion, destabilization, and also Chinese political warfare that has turned Latin America into basically a pro-China continent. There's been some success recently to counter that, but 20 years ago, Latin America was overwhelmingly America was Latin America's main trade partner. Now it's China, just down the board. And Chinese political warfare has been very effective. So when it talks about hemispheric defense, it's against China by and large. Also, there's a priority that's given in these strategy papers about defending along the first island chain. Well, against whom? And that's the Western Pacific, obviously from Japan to Taiwan down to the Philippines and Malaysia. Well, it's defense against China. There's focus also on getting America's industrial base back in order, sort of rebuilding it. And, well, what happened to the industrial base? Most of it went to China over the last 30, 40 years, courtesy of Wall Street and America's elite business class. So that is what's at stake here, and the motivation. So it really is the PRC, and you see this Chinese threat manifest throughout the world. Now, as part of this, of course, in the strategy documents, one of the other focuses and priorities is the need for partners and allies to do more for themselves. There's a clear sense throughout the papers that America is overstretched. It just doesn't have enough to take care of things by itself. Defense-wise, economically, it can't absorb sort of trade imbalances the way that it used to. Now, when it comes back to China, it talks, and this is where I have some concerns, it talks about something called a decent peace. It says we don't want regime change, we don't want to humiliate, we don't want to strangle them. Well, China would like to do all of those to us, and it's trying its very best. But there's an idea that, and it talks about deter China via strength, not confrontation. How that works, I have no idea, but there is a sense that the U.S. is going to defend itself, is going to defend its friends, but they have to do more for themselves. And there's also a little more talk about engaging with China, talking with China throughout the documents. And you see this in the U.S. military, where we seem to be slipping back to the days when every sort of general officer and flag officer was practically in a conga line to go visit China and talk to them and make friends with the Chinese, as if engagement, talking to China, has actually produced very much. But that said, those are some of the questions that arise. But make no mistake, throughout these documents, it's China that's the problem. Some of the wording is softer than one might like, and there is very much a sense throughout the world that the U.S. that it is China that say we see everywhere, and every continent, Europe, Africa, Latin America, and it's of course the Belt and Road Initiative, this economic presence that creates political dominance, political power, greased with corruption, all with an angle to eventually having a global military presence. One problem I would note is that this is broadly classified as influence operations, political warfare. The U.S. does not have a systematic political warfare plan. As hard as that is to believe, it just doesn't exist as near as I can tell. The military thinks it's the State Department's job. The State Department, when they called the relevant official into Congress to testify at the end of the Biden administration, he was asked, "Tell us about your political warfare strategy." He says, "Could you define political warfare?" Hard to believe, but that's about where we are. We're not hardly in the game. We are doing, the Trump administration is doing things, but I'm not sure it has a systematic approach just yet. Now, India did get a mention in the documents, and it wasn't much. But then again, the U.S. Navy didn't get much of a mention either, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. There is obviously a lot of progress being made on the defense and intelligence fronts, and India is mentioned as a key partner in terms for economic dealings and defense as well. It's mentioned that way if you read it closely. But one of the big things for India that gives you a sense of just where it fits into American defense strategy is the ambassador, Sergio Gore. Compare him to the previous ambassador who was there because they had to give him a job somewhere. But Sergio Gore wanted to be ambassador to India, and he was immensely powerful in the administration. Of all the U.S. ambassadors who can call up the president, have him answer the phone, you could probably fit the numbers on the fingers in one hand. He's one of those. So that's a good thing. And also, it's always worth ignoring the tweets that come out of the White House. Even we like to ignore them as well. But India is seen ultimately, it may not always be understood as such, but there are people who get it as effectively a partner against China, something of a bulwark, in fact, and it is recognized as such, and that it's finally come to that. When it comes to Afghanistan, like Afghanistan, just about everywhere else, you're seeing this Chinese involvement, Chinese influence. And there's obviously the concern of them getting in and getting access to critical minerals, for example. But it's almost everywhere you look, there's China involved. But when it comes to Afghanistan, and so I'll speak almost, I think I can almost speak generally for Americans, there's a sense of, oh, good riddance. We spent $2 trillion, 20 years, a few thousand dead, and a lot of wounded. And this was not a good idea. I heard Doha Agreement mentioned earlier. Well, what did one expect when Khalilzad was put in charge of these sorts of negotiations? This has not been America's shining moment with this. And after the defeat, the powers that be declared, well, we'll cover it with an over-the-horizon strategy, as if we've got some magic intelligence collection that lets us sort of reach out and take care of problems. I'm not convinced that's the way really sort of the general officer class makes themselves feel good, and administrations that have just gotten hammered do it as well. But it seems like we can't get away from it. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars for humanitarian purposes. There's some interest in IS Khorasan as well. And if you read the strategy documents as well, there's a desire to get rid of the Middle East, to get out of there. Say the Middle East isn't going to dominate us anymore. It specifically says that in one of the documents. Well, apparently it is, with what's happened from this morning. I think we're going to be there a while. The Pakistan and the Pakistan issue and India. With that, there's this may be a reflection of the Trump administration. His background is that he tries to work something out with everybody, and I think it is just his nature is that there's people. If I was president, I wouldn't, but it's what he does, and you see him. And I think it does reflect his background, having to deal with a lot of shady, desperate characters and corrupt officials and etc. And he's saying somehow you can manage these and slide into some sort of a deal. But that is something I think we're seeing on display here. A couple of just final things. There's a complaint that the U.S. is becoming isolationist, and I don't think it is at all. It just having a few priorities, and there is a sense that the days when it could basically run things, or it was so powerful that it could keep some sort of stability where it wanted in the region. I think that there's a real recognition it can't. Is the U.S. overstretched? Yes, it is. Militarily, it is. Economically, a few decades of insanity that really gutted too much of its industry and moved it overseas. That didn't help at all. But also, the public, I think they have kind of had enough. And this is one hears about the so-called liberal order. Well, it was ultimately the U.S. public that was underwriting this, and particularly the people whose children joined the military. And they look at it and they see, well, 20 years of war, what did we get out of this? Well, nothing. And they can look around and say, well, where's the jobs gone? Who actually cares about us? So there's been very much a shift in the U.S. public that is very skeptical about what an administration does overseas, and that recognizes itself in, I think, U.S. government policy at the time. The last minute, one often hears the word transactional assigned as an insult almost to President Trump or U.S. policy. Well, actually, if you ask most, I would hope foreign policy is transactional. I hope we get something out of it from the other side, and that's really all it's saying. And they, so in some ways, it's actually I think a lot of people would consider that actually a compliment to be accused of transactional. So just to summarize, you really see throughout these documents the threat from China and the need to counter it. This is the first time in my life that the U.S. has faced a threat where we conceivably could lose. if it's not unthinkable. And sometimes you step back in awe at what the Chinese have been able to do from a political warfare standpoint in terms of influence. They bought off probably half of Capitol Hill, for instance, all of Wall Street. And they haven't fired a shot. They've killed 800,000 of us, haven't fired a shot. So it's hard to overstate, I think, the scale and the scope of what the Chinese are doing. And the US has sort of woken up, but we'll see how it goes. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel Nisham. It was very candid and direct. And I quite agree with you that dragon is in every room, frankly. So irrespective, and if it is somehow, despite the hankering for G2 arrangement or having a good meeting with his friend Xi Jinping in Beijing, I think that China will remain a very major challenge for the United States going forward, because the topic was Cold War 2.0, and I think that 2.0, at least in the geopolitical and geotechnological sense, will be a reality. Economically, we might have many diffused economic centers so far around. And you are right about many places, but I personally feel that transactionalism is a very good thing. I mean, there's nothing wrong about it. And somehow the establishments and the governments start thinking that if that any country can be, sacrifice its own interest for yours, then we are naive, frankly. And I'm very happy for India. This was a wake-up call, because President Trump made India into some kind of an example by imposing the highest duties, 50% or so. And but we had strategic patience and managed it rather well so far. And I also agree with you that from the very beginning, that United States always thought that India could be a strategic pivot against China, even though we do not like to. But what has happened to Ukraine should be an example for the Indian policymakers also. That how are we going to, maintain our strategic autonomy and be where we want to be at the end of the day. I mean, India is looking to become a developed country by 2047. Getting embroiled in wars does not take you there. And so that is very important. That I'm very happy for your President Trump. You mentioned about, I think many people say he's isolationist, but as someone from your heritage think tank, foundation rather, mentioned it very well. And he said that Trump is the worst isolationist. And so I guess that he's involved everywhere, but his attention span is very short. And so that is why he moves every day morning to a new issue, a new problem. And Middle East, you also mentioned, I mean, that's very important to understand, that he may wish to withdraw from the Middle East, but Middle East should not let them withdraw from here. So that is there. At this note, I want to thank all the three panelists for an exceptionally bright presentations and touching upon the major things. Now, Samiksha, you may take over on the questions and other things. Yes.
With this, we come to the end of the final session. I would thank to all our session chairs and all distinguished speakers for such an enlightening session. On the behalf of Indeed Research Forum, I would like to sincerely thank all of you for our first question. So the first question is, to what extent does the largely symbolic response of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to the symbolic exclusions of women in Afghanistan reflect structural limitations with the organization itself, rather than a lack of concern? Given these limitations, what credible leverage, if any, can the OIC exercise meaningfully alter Taliban's policy on women without enforcing claims to external or non-Islamic interference?
Samiksha, to whom this question is addressed?
Sir, I think Dr. Aryan Sharifi was assigned to this question, and also Ambassador Sri Kumar Menon, sir.
Dr. Aryan, you are on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. If I may, very quickly, well, first of all, I am not sure the Organization of Islamic Cooperation really has had any success in its entire existence on any fronts, really. I mean, the intention, behind establishing it decades ago was to bring together the Islamic world, and not in terms of a military alliance, but at least in terms of an ideological alliance, in terms of an identity alliance, to bring the Islamic world together. But then, even from the outset, it was really taken over by Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt at the time, and he used to use that as tried at least to use it as a tool to pursue his own ambitious agenda of really leading, if you will, of the Islamic world. So I really see the OIC mainly as a symbolic thing. I mean, anything, it just has had some symbolic gestures. I remember during the Afghan Republic, when I was in the former government, we successively approached the OIC for taking really a strong stance, at least ideologically, to claim that the jihad the Taliban had declared against us was actually not suited, was not correct, and it was not justified. But even then, they really failed to do anything towards that. And today, even though I've seen on many occasions the OIC has had certain statements about the rights of women in Afghanistan and how the Taliban should change this archaic outlook towards women and in general towards governance, but it's just been at the level of statement. I mean, I think the real change, if at all it could be possible, cannot really come in the Taliban's outlook towards women and towards human rights and towards women's rights and towards governance in general, will not really happen through just symbolic statements. It would have to come, it would have to come through a structural change within the country itself. Now, I'm saying that it would have to come through this structural change. However, on practice, on the ground, I don't really see this possible at any time, at least in the foreseeable future, because the Taliban are simply in power, in full power. And inside the country, there is really no strong opposition sufficient enough to change their behavior. Outside of the country, nobody is interested. I mean, the regional countries on their own, I don't think have on their own the capacity to affect such a structural change. And beyond that, beyond the region, everybody, and again, incorrectly, still looks up to the United States to do something. And as I mentioned, and then of course, Colonel Newsham also mentioned, I don't think the United States has any interest in doing really anything in that country, in that region, strong enough to affect that kind of a change, at least in the foreseeable future. I don't see that really happening. And so while we say that a change must come, we don't really see elements that would affect that change on the ground. How this would emerge in the future and how it would evolve in the future, honestly, I don't know. My only hope is that, and I do say this, I've had several research trips to Afghanistan over the past 3 years, and I have met with the leadership of the Taliban. And as an Afghan American, I've consistently told them that what they're doing cannot fly for too long. I mean, it is not slightly wrong. It's entirely wrong. The outlook they have towards governance, towards women, toward people, towards that entire ideology. This is just not going to last for too long. My only hope is that the Taliban leadership would get to a point where they would see that this is actually not possible to continue for too long, and it's not justified to continue for too long, and it's not okay to continue for too long, so that they would come to their senses and they would start some reform. That's the only hope that I have. Apart from that, I don't really see any tangible force that would make that change. countries like India might be that, with the influence they have, with the relationship they have with the Taliban right now, might be able to at least push them and persuade them to that, to get to that conclusion. But if, when I see my fellow Afghans in America or in Europe, everybody is still looking at Washington to do, I don't think Washington would do anything, at least anytime soon, to affect that change.
Well, I'll also just add a few lines to what has been said by the people. Actually, for the Taliban government, it's more or less a person's choice, because if they have to survive, and their very existence depends on the fact that they reformat their governance system and move and at least give some sort of a semblance of freedom for the women in Afghanistan, remove malnutrition, remove entirely the allegation that the previous Taliban government had faced with regard to gender-based violence and even forced marriages. So if the Taliban government wants to really continue as a viable constitutional, or if not a constitutional regime, at least continue to provide a good governance structure, I think it's important for it to revise its attitude towards women, and the OIC, of course, has to put pressure on Taliban-led government in Afghanistan to see that change happening.
Thank you, sir, for such enlightening answers. So, again, a question for you, sir, Shri Kumar Menon, sir. How does the Taliban non-democratic governance and human rights record affects India's engaging strategy?
Well, India has always welcomed, it's basically viewed the ethnic tensions in Afghanistan, particularly the Pashtun dominance and the Taliban regime, with concern. But at the same time, India has taken a very, a very open view with regard to Taliban. Because we have to work with Taliban to make sure that we cannot wish away our neighbor. So the fact remains that we have to work with Taliban and make it happen and make that relationship go further. So I think there's no choice really in that case. So beyond that, I think my other colleagues might be able to put in a little more better light on that.
Thank you, sir. So our next question is to Colonel Brandushan. How has China's engagement with post-2021 Afghanistan shaped the structure, behavior, and external legitimacy of Taliban governance? To what extent does China's emphasis on stability, non-interference, and counter-terrorism functions as a form of indirect propaganda that consolidates Taliban's rule without demanding political or governance reform?
I think the Chinese presence in Afghanistan is not really intended to improve anything in any sense in terms of Taliban behavior or governance, except to the extent that it keeps the terrorism at bay. It keeps Chinese commercial interests. It keeps the Chinese business people, just Chinese people in Afghanistan, from getting attacked, from getting killed. And that is something that you see in a lot of places, where it's ultimately an engagement of a sort designed to allow Chinese business and commercial interests and the attendant political influences that come from that to operate. And it works as long as it works, but it doesn't tend to, say, improve anything in terms of local governance. In fact, I would suggest it tends to make it worse over time when it basically contributes to sort of really a corrupt form of governance that creates a lot of unhappiness, and it explodes at some point. So you talk about transactional, where the Chinese almost give the word a bad meaning. So I don't see them having much influence on the Afghan government or Taliban behavior in any respect, other than as it directly affects Chinese interests and presence.
If I may just add a few words to what the Colonel said. Exactly. I mean, Chinese presence almost everywhere, and that's sort of an extension of it in Afghanistan, is transactional, but only one way. They just want to take and not give anything. And even in the commercial sector, in the mineral sector, the Chinese are very much involved across Afghanistan right now. It's really plundering. I mean, it's the way they're plundering things in Africa. That's exactly what they're doing in Afghanistan right now. Not only don't they not care about the society and the governance and human rights, that doesn't even come into their vocabulary. But even on strict business transactions, they just take it. They don't want to even give. So that transaction is really one way, and it's gotten to a point where the Taliban government has become really aware of it right now. They are upset with it, and the several of the mineral contracts with China has been cancelled by the Taliban government. The INAC, the largest copper deposit, INAC copper mine has been cancelled. The northern oil and gas extraction in northern Afghanistan, that was also given to the Chinese. That has also been cancelled. So even the Taliban government is not happy with the strictly business transactional relations they have with China, let alone any other thing. So there's really no hope at all that any Chinese presence in Afghanistan, or I would say anywhere in the world, would actually lead to anything positive in a tangible manner. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for such insightful answer. So our next question is to Ambassador Shri Kumar Menon. Should India maintain contact with the anti-Taliban faction, such as the National Resistance Force and other currently based in Tajikistan? I believe New Delhi shouldn't make the mistake of putting all its eggs on the basket of Taliban.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, the recent improvement of relations with the Taliban government in Afghanistan, of course, no doubt a pragmatic shift in India's, I would say, regional strategy. So it actually also is a policy which factors the post-2021 realities. I mean, we cannot, as I said earlier, cannot wish away the fact that Taliban is ruling Afghanistan at present. And it, of course, the policy prioritizes national interests over its ideological concerns. You mentioned Tajik, but I'm not very sure how it is going to be seen. But the diplomatic recognition of the Taliban provides India the leverage to ensure continued flow of humanitarian aid and also support Afghanistan's reconstruction and development projects. So I don't see that it coming in the way with regard to our engagement with Tajikistan or any other country in the neighboring region itself. So I think it answers the question.
Thank you, sir. So next question is also for you. During President Putin's visit, India-Russia emphasis to cooperate in Afghanistan, Russia has also formally recognized Taliban. Do you believe that India-Russia interests in Afghanistan converge? How does US and China would see India-Russia cooperation with Taliban? Like I also mentioned that it is a question to all the panelists.
Well, Russia, of course, and India, of course, can play a big role in terms of supporting Afghanistan's revival, especially with regard to the humanitarian aspects. Beyond that, I think as of now, India is looking specifically at its own India-aided projects, which create opportunities, economic opportunities, improved connectivity also for us, and enhanced security and prosperity for the Afghan people. Because the relationship is more in terms of our need to check the growing influence of, or you can say, the influence of Pakistan in Afghanistan. So to that extent, our outreach towards Taliban is Taliban government. It's more pragmatic than anything else. So again, when it comes to Russia, I think the same thing applies for Russia also. So I don't see much of a change in that approach really. And as far as China is concerned and the US, I think the Colonel will be able to answer you better.
Yeah, first I would note that when it comes to connections with Russia, boy, that's from a US policy perspective is pretty close to radioactive. I think, as people can see, it's very sensitive. When it comes to China, it's once again, and I mentioned this in my remarks, that one really wondered, we have not been particularly good at taking on the Chinese political warfare. And we would, I think, do well to actually rely on other, work with friends who can do this better than us and have better capabilities for operating in certain locations as well. But this really is the issue of the day, is how the U.S. is going to really block Chinese efforts and actually build something better for it. When it comes to Afghanistan, as I mentioned, there isn't a whole lot of interest in the place, although we, being the U.S., we do pay attention to it and do, say, have some capability for acting if necessary, if threatened. But at the political warfare end of the game, that's not the highest priority as near as I can tell.
I'll just add one more point, if it is not out of place. No, the engagement, India's engagement actually provides a stabilizing buffer for Afghanistan, because it's an opportunity for India to seek and also provide landlocked Afghanistan with an alternative to its earlier dependence on Pakistan-dependent trade routes and the energy corridors in the Central Asian region, like of course the INSTC and the important Chabad port, which is the lifeline for us also. Besides checking cross-border terrorist, a less vulnerable Afghanistan will be more supportive economically and as a strategic ally for India.
I think, Dr. Aryan, this question on Russia is also addressed to you. So if you would like to take this up.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, first of all, let's see what Russia's recognition of the Taliban government has meant, really. I mean, in practice, it hasn't meant anything, really, because there were two expectations, in my view, as to what would happen. The first expectation was that if Russia recognizes the Taliban government, it would start a trend of recognition, at least in the region. And, following Russia, the countries in Central Asia would recognize, and then potentially Iran would recognize, and then possibly China would recognize. Well, at least, it would break that stalemate of diplomatic recognition of the Taliban government. That clearly has not happened. So that is that. The second expectation was that, at least with the Russian recognition, that the relationship between Russia and the Taliban government would really tighten up, and cooperation would increase, and they could do all kinds of things together. That also has not happened. That pragmatic relationship that Russia had with the Taliban government from day one, that has really sustained until now. So there hasn't been really any change. So in my view, just Russia being the only country that has recognized the Taliban government, I don't think it's had any impact. And the Taliban now, from what I hear, they also understand that it hasn't meant any further development in terms of diplomatic recognition, or even the tightening of relationship between Russia and the Taliban government. If I were to guess a counterfactual, I would actually say that maybe the Russians even regret that decision. They've put themselves into a situation where they're under somewhat of, regional and international kind of like, eye rolling by doing that. And on the other hand, they have not really achieved anything. By the way, let me also add, sorry, in my interactions, and I apologize for the break. In my interactions, in 3 trips I've had to Afghanistan purely on research, for research purposes, I've come to understand, at least subtly, not anything directly, that when it comes to the issue of diplomatic recognition from the Taliban's perspective, they are looking to the West, really. The value of diplomatic recognition for them is not regional, but it is really Western. And at the top of the West, of course, the United States. As long as the United States, the West in general, does not recognize the Taliban government, I don't think even regional recognition would be that much valuable for them from the vantage point that they are seeing. And to a good extent, that also makes sense because at least, if we still think that the Bretton Woods system exists and functions and works, without American recognition, without Western recognition, entry into the Bretton Woods system, those 3 main pillars, the United Nations, representation at the United Nations, representation at the World Bank, and representation in the IMF, will not happen. And if those do not happen, there would not be any really practical difference in terms of recognition or non-recognition. And the Taliban leadership seems to understand this fully. So they're really looking into that when it comes to the issue of recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before concluding, I would like to request all of you, if you would, if anybody of you would further like to add any other points, sir. Okay, so with this, we come to the end of this final session. I would like to thank our session chair and all our distinguished speakers for such an enlightening session. I, on the behalf of Indic Researchers Forum, would like to sincerely thank all our distinguished speakers, panelists, moderators, and participants for their valuable insights and active engagement. I would also like to acknowledge the dedicated efforts of the organizing team and express our gratitude for our supporters and partners for all their continued encouragement and cooperation. Thank you all for being a part of the India-Afghanistan Security Dialogue. We look forward to continued engagement and meaningful collaboration in future.